Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today is a bit different in terms of format. I have been wanting to do this for a long time, but at the same time, also putting it off for a long time, which is sharing my own story. And I think throughout this podcast project, I have been, looking back a bit deliberately standing to the side of my own experience with Vulvodynia and Vaginismus as a host. And even though I've shared parts of my story and tried to give context to the conversations I've had with experts in this field throughout, I think I have just been holding back a bit from sharing my full story end to end. And I've done some reflecting around my aversion or hesitation towards this. And for a bit of context, I think those who really know me would consider me quite an open person. I really like to get into the deeper stuff with my friends and people that I'm around. I don't like to stay surface level in my relationships. But what I've realized is that I have a very strong pattern of actually being open about difficult things as I am still in it. I really struggle with sharing stories that don't have clean endings. And my story with vulvodynia and vaginismus, or vulvovaginal pain in general, doesn't. It's non-linear, it's layered, and it's very much ongoing. And just for context, I've actually tried to record this episode 2 times and ended up listening back to it and being like, no, it's not right. But I think waiting for making the perfect episode on this might mean never sharing it at all. So here goes. I've been quite clear about the fact that this podcast grew directly out of my own experience. And I think you deserve to know the full context of what that experience was. So let's go back to the beginning when I started experiencing pain. So this was around 5 years ago. And just to paint the picture of where I was at the time, I was newly in love with the man who is now my husband. Life at the time felt really open and expansive. I was just about to finish my master's degree. I was living in Copenhagen at the time, had just decided on the job that I was going to start after my studies, which I was excited about. And it felt like a really optimistic, light, happy time. And me and my now husband were kind of traveling around a bit together and just having a really great time. And I felt genuinely happy. And then all of a sudden, I started experiencing this like stinging, sharp pain first after sex and then also during sex. And at that point, I'd never experienced pain during sex before or any type of vulvar or vaginal pain. I will say it wasn't really dramatic at first. It was kind of subtle enough to minimize, but also persistent enough to be slightly destabilizing. So at the beginning, I kind of just assumed it was temporary. Weeks passed and it just didn't go away. So I decided to go to my doctor, my general practitioner, again at this time in Copenhagen in Denmark. She did an examination of me, looked at the tissue, couldn't see anything wrong, and kind of ruled out STIs or STDs or bacterial vaginosis, and kind of just concluded that everything looked normal. And she kind of shrugged it off as saying like, this just happens to lots of women, it'll just go away. And I think that sentence did two things. It gave me hope in one end, but then also I think created a delay in my response to this simultaneously. So I did that, I waited, and it just didn't go away. So again, I was in the situation where I was experiencing pain during and after sex with penetrative sex. Wasn't really experiencing any pain otherwise in terms of like day-to-day situations. So I kind of just like accepted that that was the case, which now just like saying that makes me quite emotional. Already, if you don't know me, I'm very emotional and I cry quite easily. So, but yeah, wasn't expecting that now. um, yeah. So some time later, like a year and a half later, at this point, I'd moved to London, started working there. I was living with my partner, and I went to the GP for like a routine appointment and to get my hormonal coil removed. I had the Mirena coil at this point, and I'd been having some problems with my coil. Like I couldn't feel the strings anymore, and it had displaced itself. It proved really, really difficult to remove. Anyways, I went to my GP to try to get it removed, and I remember like the clinic so well, which was just like a slightly scary place. There was a receptionist working there who I now know has like a real reputation on Google reviews because she was just really mean and angry. So yeah, it was a slightly like hostile place. And I remember like going into the room of my GP. I remember it now was like slightly claustrophobic. There was no natural light. It was like a bit dark and gray, and I was rushed in like you are often at the doctor's. It was my GP and like an assistant of her. I'm not exactly sure what her role was, but at least there were two people there. And they attempted to insert the speculum, and I was just in excruciating pain, like this feeling of like really sharp pain around my vestibule, but also like really, I'm not even sure how to explain this feeling, or just feeling like someone was splitting me open. Like it was very painful. And I obviously like kind of screamed out. I was in a lot of pain, and I just remember the look on their faces so well. They were in such shock. Not really like concern, I would say, but more like a shock, like, okay, this is a routine appointment. What is happening? Why is she in so much pain? And I remember just feeling like I was really making it difficult for them, making a big deal out of something routine. And I remember feeling really scared, not just of the pain, but also just of what it meant, because I knew in the back of my mind that there was this thing called vaginismus. I'd heard someone when I was in middle school back in Norway. I remember there was like talk of a girl that had pain during sex and had something called vaginismus. So I knew what it was, but I'd just been, I think, distancing myself from it because I really didn't want that to be my reality, even though I had been experiencing pain during sex for like 1.5 years. And that just like that arm's length, like pushing it away, just collapsed in that moment. I was like, okay, something is not right. And I also want to take a minute here to talk about the reaction, or what I experienced as the reaction from the doctor and the assistant who was there. Because what I know now is that pain during a speculum exam is not rare, it's not unusual, and it's also not overreacting. And I think my understanding of their reaction is like surprise by my pain, I think points to like the system failure that we're seeing, as opposed to like a personal failure that I felt at the time. Yeah, so I just felt really lonely and really scared in that instance, but also knew that I had to really like do something about this and start pushing for real answers and figure out what was happening. So I went on to find a gynecologist privately. I was lucky enough to have really good medical insurance at the time, so I was able to see a private gynecologist who came highly recommended very shortly thereafter. I think it was like the next day or something like that. And she turned out to be brilliant. She was actually the first person that I interviewed on this podcast. It was Dr. Tanya Adib. She is such a cool lady and really just an amazing doctor. And I came into her practice, a more beautiful, well-lit, natural light room, which was nice. And then she started examining me, and she started doing like the cotton swab test or Q-tip test, where she was pressing at specific points on the vulvar vestibule to start mapping out tenderness. And most of you, I think, listening will know what this is. It's a simple examination. It takes like maybe a minute maximum, and it starts, understanding where the pain is, how bad it is. So it's really simple. It takes minutes, and nobody had done it before. And she was quite quick to diagnose me with vulvodynia. And that at the time felt like progress, because what I was experiencing had a name. I felt like I was taken really seriously. That was a big part of giving me some hope that this would resolve and get better, even though that appointment was fantastic in many ways because I felt like I was being taken seriously. I had a name for what was going on. I think looking back, it would have been more precise to say that I had provoked vestibulodynia because I wasn't experiencing pain continuously through the day. It was only in instances where I was, mainly penetrative sex. At that point, I was also starting to experience some pain with tampons and also sometimes like prolonged sitting on a bike. And at the time, I was put on a treatment plan of a low dose antidepressant, nortriptyline, it's called, and also referred to a pelvic floor physio. And I really committed to both, but the results weren't coming. And I was also in the midst of carrying something else entirely. And this is the part that I've been most afraid to tell because around the same time as my symptoms started appearing, so like around 5 years ago, memories connected to a sexual assault years earlier started to surface. And I started experiencing PTSD symptoms with like quite heavy flashbacks of things that I'd suppressed. And it was kind of ramping up along the same time, like started out a bit and then it just became more and more pressing. And again, this was something that had happened years previously that was around like at the time around 8 years ago. And at the time when I started getting those flashbacks, I didn't really see the connection then to my vulvar pain, but it was only in retrospect that I realized that the pain, the vulvar pain, and the trauma really surfaced at almost exactly the same time. And I think what I was really feeling at this point was two things that were making it very hard to be in my own body. So I was really struggling to not numb myself completely from the pain and from those flashbacks. It was quite difficult to navigate because I was lucky enough that I was seeing this amazing pelvic floor physio. She was helping me lots in understanding what was going on and starting to understand that I needed to work on my pelvic floor because my pelvic floor muscles were really tight. And just started learning more about vulvar and vaginal pain. And I had been tasked with doing these like dilator exercises at home, desensitization practices, practices to look in the mirror and do my desensitization practice in order to start understanding that I wasn't actually under threat. But I think the fact that I was still like very much processing this trauma, which was really pressing, made it just very difficult to be present with sensations that just felt really frightening. So I just found myself like I couldn't really do the practices consistently. And I talked to Kelly, who's the founder of Pelva, about this briefly in a few episodes ago, that I am a very diligent person. Like I've always been quite disciplined and ever since like I was just a child. But in this instance, I was just like really unable to do things that should be improving my situation. Even though I was like desperate for something that could help me, I just somehow like wasn't able to stick to my dilating routine, for instance. And I also stopped taking the nortriptyline, the low dose antidepressant. It was giving me like some side effects that I wasn't too keen on. And I don't know, I was just feeling like I think I was starting to feel really hopeless about it. And it still like pains me to this day to admit that I couldn't do these practices consistently. I feel like, I find it really shameful. And I think now looking back, that disassociation and numbing was probably protective in some ways. Like I needed to just give it more time. I think especially like working through the trauma, but it did keep me really stuck. And the question that I really couldn't shake was, what if this is purely psychosomatic? Like, what if this is just, there's nothing actually wrong with my vulvar vagina, but actually it's just like, my trauma creating pain. And so like the pain was very real, but so was also all the noise around, like, was my body doing something it couldn't stop because my mind hadn't found a way through? And I think, yeah, again, that question pulled me away from the formal treatment plan and toward anything that could maybe help me in both the pain and like the trauma processing. And so now I started going into this treatment rabbit hole. And at this point, I started becoming extremely proactive, doing loads of research, trying to find out what could potentially be a helpful therapy for me to try. And I was really like open to anything at this point. I tried everything. I tried loads of breath work. I tried lots of somatic release. I tried hypnosis. I tried psychedelic-assisted therapy. That was mainly to treat the PTSD, but still, I tried ecstatic dance. I don't know if any of you have been to that before, but it's essentially like a group of people coming together and just like shaking out and dancing, like trying to channel like what your body wants to do naturally. But I found that I was still quite in my head and like thinking like, how can I do this in the right way? But anyways, that was that. And then I also tried something called yoni de-armoring. I look back at that period with a lot of tenderness. I was kind of running around like a headless chicken, trying anything and everything. And I don't think it was like from a place of recklessness. It was more like deep desperation plus some form of agency. I just really wanted to find something that could help. But I was also very much at a state where I felt like I was outsourcing everything. Like I was very much relying on someone to tell me how to get through this. And again, like that paired with the dissociation and like numbing of not really confronting what was really going on in terms of the trauma being there in the background and really, yeah, reminding me like every day what had happened. Yeah, it was a very, very difficult time. And I think many of you will probably relate to this. The sheer like energy that goes into going down these treatment rabbit holes, like the sheer volume of appointments, the admin, the insurance fights, all the money that's going towards this, like it is really exhausting. And also the point around having to tell your story from scratch to every new person. I think that's also exhausting in its own specific way, and like getting your hopes up in some instances that something might work and then it doesn't. And yeah, so I was just faced with this central contradiction of like desperately seeking solutions, but then also being fundamentally unable to be present in my body. And so I want to move to the point which to me was my rock bottom. I remember this so well. I had a new pelvic floor physio that I was starting to see because the previous one that I'd gone to had moved. I tried a couple, nothing had really clicked, and then I had this new appointment and I'd really fought to get there. I had like this insurance dispute, they weren't going to cover it, and it was like weeks of pushing. And then finally I get to this appointment, have like this intro session. Like she just gave me a short assessment in that first intro, but we didn't do any like exercises together. She just gave me a pamphlet of exercises to do basically. And I came back a week or so later, and at that point I'd really like made a real effort to like, okay, this time I'm gonna do the dilator exercises really diligently. And I came back and she asked me like, how's it gone? And I started to explain to her what I'd been doing and how it had been going. And then she just stopped me and she was basically saying like, you've been doing them all wrong. And this was 3 or 4 years in to when I first started experiencing pain, probably 3 years in. And at that point, I felt like I had fought so hard. I'd done so much on my own to try to like to get better. I tried every treatment I could come across, and I'd done so much research and like thought I'd really understood how to do these dilator exercises, but then it was basically like a door being slammed in my face and I felt like a complete failure. Like I should have been able to do this better. I didn't. And yeah, I'm just a huge failure. And I remember feeling so incredibly sad and hopeless, and I had to like quit the appointment earlier and just go out to the bathroom and just cry and cry and cry because there was just so much frustration and anger and grief there from like what this pain um was causing in my life. And I think another part of why I haven't really been able to do this episode yet was just that I found it so difficult to really put into words just how much this has impacted my life and my sense of self. And um yeah, I really struggled putting that into words. I think that it's really pulled out some really challenging thoughts around like worthiness and being lovable and being just worth being with, that have been really, really difficult to navigate. And I've been so lucky that my partner has been so supportive and optimistic through this all. And he's never had like any open doubt towards me that this won't resolve and that we'll find a solution, and that he still wants to be with me even though this is something that I'm going through. I still have had this like really nagging feeling like this is just gonna break the relationship. This is gonna, yeah, this is basically just here to ruin my life. And so, yeah, I was really at rock bottom there. And I remember like I actually took a video of myself crying, not to share, but just to mark the moment because yeah, I just really wanted to document like what rock bottom felt like or looks like. And at that point also like I had worked so hard to be try to be really optimistic and proactive about, I know that I a big part of for me like getting better I think was having faith in that like things would get better. But at that point I just felt like a big brick of blocks had fell down on me, and it was like, this is permanent, or you're never going to feel better. And I remember just feeling like a shell of myself, and that just felt like the color had just drained out of the world. And I think honestly at this point I was quite depressed and just going through the grief of like wanting to be close to someone, but then feeling like your body close itself off again and again and again was really, really challenging. And I also think there was just so much shame tangled into all of it, and also just feeling the burden of carrying it mostly alone, which brings me to, I guess, like the next part of my story, which is finding a bit of community. Oof, okay, I'm going to take a sip of tea. This is a tough topic. Not this one that I'm going to start discussing now, but the previous one. Okay, so at this point, again, really at rock bottom. And I had been like really diligently researching and trying to find information that could help me. And at this point, I came across the Reddit, Vaginismus and Vulvodynia subreddits. And I really had just thought that Reddit was a place for like young guys and gamers, but apparently it was like a really bustling community for these two conditions, which were just so touching to me. I remember like discovering them, and I just sat there and like scrolled and scrolled and scrolled, and also like crying, not really sad crying, but just like crying from recognition, because what I read there was basically like direct reflections of things that I had experienced. And for the first time, I really felt so seen and so understood, and just like really like I wasn't alone in this. And to me, that made the world of a difference. And I'd realized at that point that I'd just been really carrying the isolation alongside the condition so heavily. I hadn't really separated those two things before until that moment. And something shifted within me. And I shifted from this feeling of like true hopelessness um, to feeling like I was ready to fight. Not because anything changed medically, but because I was no longer alone. And I became more and more angry instead of like sad and depressed, because I just had this like recurring thought, like, why is no one speaking about this? Like, why do we not know more about this? And I started feeling so much rage and then a lot of empowerment to try to do something about it. And so I think at that point, I kind of moved without planning to, from this like silent sufferer to really wanting to do something and feeling so passionately about it. So at that point, I suggested a group call on the subreddit, and basically just a place for people to like talk and connect. And we had like 40 people who said they were interested within like 24 hours. So I think that moment is really like the seed of this podcast, because I realized like, okay, not only is there a big group of women and people with vulvodynia and vaginismus that are actively seeking a sense of community, but they want to talk to me, which was really nice. We had that group call. It was just really such a heartwarming conversation. It was always a bit random because it was just like put together last minute, but we had some people come on who'd been cured from vaginismus. This was mainly for vaginismus. Someone who'd been cured from vaginismus that came on and told their story, and then people were asking questions, and it was just like a really, really nice forum for talking to people in the same situation. And so again, I feel like that moment was really the seed of this podcast, and I was really keen to do something to try to make use of the years of struggle that I had experienced, and this enormous amount of research that I'd done, significant money spent on seeing all these specialists. And I kept on thinking, like, what about people who don't have that time, that money, or that stubbornness to like keep going? And at that point, I'd like started to map out some really great specialists across the world who were doing some really brilliant work in this. And I was like, how do you democratize access to this? And honestly, as well, I was just really, really fed up with the silence. I was really sick of conditions affecting millions being treated as like niche or embarrassing. And I remember really well talking to my very good friend Frida at this point. We were talking about like, how can I actually do something to try to tackle this big problem that I'm seeing? And she was the person who was very encouraging about me starting the podcast. And so, yeah, I decided to start the podcast not because I had personally healed or like been cured from my pain, but because I wanted to create the resource that I so deeply wished that I had. And you may be wondering where I am today in terms of my journey. So where I am now is at a stage where the pain that was confined to the vulvar vestibule is more or less resolved, which I think is really significant. But I still experience quite a lot of tension and tightness, like in the deeper pelvic floor muscles, which makes penetration difficult. And I still struggle with like speculum exams, for instance. Even though I'm still working through it, something feels genuinely different. It feels like I'm moving through a lot of that aversion I've had previously, and I feel less frightened and more empowered that things are going in the right direction. So again, I'm not healed, I'm not done, but I'm more optimistic than I've ever been. And I want to be honest about something that I sometimes find genuinely frustrating to admit, which is that I don't have a clean answer for what got me here. Like I have some ideas. I have things that I want to share that I think made a real difference, and I definitely will. But I think I'm going to dedicate full episodes to the things I think actually moved the needle for me, because they deserve that level of attention and depth. But the honest truth is that it's muddy, it's nonlinear, and it's difficult to point to specific treatments that actually made a big difference for me. And for someone like me, I'm quite analytical. I like to be able to point to something and say, like, this is the variable, this is what contributed to what. That is actually quite a difficult thing to sit with. And I really would love nothing else than to be able to hand you like a clean list of this is what helped me, but I just can't, not fully. And what I've come to understand through all of these conversations I've had on this podcast and conversations with you guys is that that's actually really, really normal. That's what I hear from so many people in this space. It's rarely one thing. It's rarely linear. And it often can't be distilled into a protocol or a step by step. And I think sometimes that's actually what we just desperately want to hear. And I think that's quite clear from my story as well, that like the one answer, the one thing that will fix it, and also the one thing that caused it. I think for me, it's definitely been multifaceted. And yeah, it just hasn't been my experience. And I think it's important to say that out loud, even though it's definitely not a satisfying thing to say. So yeah, that's me. That's where I am. I'm basically just one of you guys really seeking to understand more about what's going on, which brings me to the podcast itself and actually something quite significant that I want to share with you. So, when I first started this podcast, I basically just created what I needed and couldn't find. I really wanted a space where women and people with these conditions could hear from world leading experts, have their experiences validated, feel less alone, um, and yeah, just find like a place to belong basically. And when I was naming it, I was looking for something that captured all of that, something that kind of held both the seriousness of what we go through and also the part that doesn't get talked about enough, which is the like the like absurdity of it all. The absurdity of navigating a condition that the medical system largely just pretends doesn't exist. And I felt that I really found her in Baobo. And I have to give credit to my brilliant friend who I grew up with, Wanda, who is this amazing woman who's really into ancient mythology. She's incredibly intelligent and she's particularly knowledgeable about Celtic mythology, Greek mythology. She's just really cool. And she directed me to Baobo. And Baobo is a figure from Greek mythology. And honestly, the moment I came across her, it just felt right. So the story goes that when Demeter, who's the goddess of harvest, lost her daughter Persephone to the underworld, she was devastated. She stopped eating, she stopped tending to the earth, she was just completely consumed by grief. And as a result of that, also, the entire world was just barren because of her grief. Nothing could grow, and she was kind of wandering, just inconsolable. And it was Baobo who broke through. Baobo was this figure who was a walking vulva, this irreverent, completely unashamed figure who, in the version I love the most of the story, she basically lifted her skirt, wiggled her belly, and just made Demeter laugh. And she did this gesture that was just so brazen and so human that it cracked something opened and Demeter started laughing. And in that laughter, she kind of found the strength to keep going. And I just thought, like, that's it. That's the energy. That's what this should be. Because I think that what makes these conditions so isolating isn't just the pain, it's the shame and the silence which is wrapped around it. And Baobo is kind of the antidote to that. She, I think, just approaches the body with lightness, with laughter, without apology. So the podcast started as Baobo, and in the beginning, it was literally like, it was me, my little mic, my very supportive husband, and also a few very close, very supportive friends and family listening at first. And truly, like, that was the audience. It was basically like shouting into the ether. Um, but it has really grown since then, very slowly at first, and then quite suddenly. And like last week alone, I think I received around 10 messages from people with vulvovaginal pain who were sharing their stories with me, their versions basically of what I described today, their rabbit holes and their rock bottoms and their moments of recognition. And every single time I receive one of those messages, I'm just reminded of why I started this. Because the truth is, like, there's so many stories that resemble mine in some ways, and your experiences are so varied in terms of the presentations, the treatments, the paths through, which is part of why I want to keep bringing you different stories and different voices, not just mine. we've had some incredible guests come on already, and I want to replicate a bit of what I felt on that early Reddit group call, that feeling of like sitting in a room together, maybe laughing about our situations a little bit, being honest about how hard it is, and just not being alone in it. And so it felt like the right time to tell you that the podcast has a new name. We are now officially the world's tightest community. And I think we're brought together by a lot of grief and frustration, a lot of appointments, a lot of fighting to be taken seriously. But also, I think, and this is what I felt from those Reddit forums and from your messages and from every conversation I've had on this show, there is something else there too. There is like real connection and a tightness, if you will, in every sense of the word, something that and it goes beyond the struggle. So that's my story, or at least that's my story for now, because like I said, it doesn't have a clean ending yet. And I'm slowly but surely learning to be okay with that. My journey is complicated, as I know yours is probably too. And I think the frustrating thing is like, if this was simple, it would have just been solved a long time ago. And so I'm not here as someone who has all the answers. I'm here as someone who's still in it. I'm still figuring it out, and who just really, really wanted a community like this to exist. So I, yeah, thank you for being here. I truly appreciate you. And I think those of you who I've been lucky enough to connect with. I was voice noting someone last week, and she was saying like, I can really hear the excitement in your voice. And I was like, yeah, I am truly excited to hear from you guys, and it means the world to me. So please reach out if you ever want to talk. And I'd love to hear from you what you want to hear on this podcast. And I will start doing some polls this week on Instagram to see what you guys would like in terms of ways to connect further beyond this podcast. I have some ideas, and I really want to hear your views on them as well. But yeah, just thank you for being here, and I will see you next week.